All right, my mic, yes, excellent. Welcome everybody. I'm Alexander Rose, I'm the executive director here at Long Now, and a while back when I saw this book come out, I realized that there's so many times where we have talks from astronomers about billions of years or geologists about millions of years. But there's this one passage that when Stuart Brand launched Long Now, he wrote in the kind of launching essay, which was, "Civilization is revving itself into a pathologically short attention span. The trend might be coming from the acceleration of technology, the short horizon perspective of market-driven economics, the next election perspective of democracies, or the distractions, personal multitasking. All are on the increase. Some sort of balancing corrective to the short-sightedness is needed." And that was what launched Long Now. And we've kind of dealt with a lot of those subjects, but it's very rare that we deal with that personal multitasking part. And so when I saw this book, I thought it was a perfect opportunity to kind of look not at necessarily the next 10,000 years, but at least the arc of our lives and how we think about that in a more personal way. And Dorie Clark is the perfect person to tell us about that. Thank you.
So we've all been through a lot over the last couple of years. I know even here in San Francisco, it's a new thing to be able to come back out to events and to be around other people and to be able to socialize freely. We all had things in March, April, May of 2020 that we thought we were going to do, and almost none of them happened. We got hit by a tidal wave. And I remember for me, you probably all have your moment when you first realized what COVID was going to be, when there were the first intimations of what would happen. And coming at it 2.5 years later in a talk like this, where we're able to reconvene and reconnect, is kind of amazing, because I took a selfie of myself. I wanted to remember this. In March of 2020, I was in New York City, where I was living at the time. I was giving a talk at Hunter College, and about 150 people had RSVP'd for this talk. And by the time the talk rolled around, about 20 intrepid souls showed up, because they were starting to realize that something was amiss, something was awry, and maybe it wasn't a good idea anymore to be coming out to an event. So we had to recalibrate. We had to suddenly discover terminology that we had never used before, social distancing. We suddenly had to stand in line at the grocery store. We suddenly had to find new ways of relating to each other. We fled from downtown, and certainly that was the case in San Francisco as well as New York, and started living our lives in so many ways online. And we had to do it fast. There had been, for 15, 20 years, scholars of the study of work from home and remote work, and how could it possibly function, and what would it look like, and what would it take for companies to be able to accede to this future that everybody thought was inevitable but would happen over the course of decades. And it turns out, of course, that somehow we figured it out, because we had to, in the course of 2 or 3 weeks. We were all thrown into it, and we discovered pretty rapidly that there was a downside to that we would have to cope with. But we did. We figured it out. And in the meantime, the pandemic forced us to be innovative in some positive ways. This is a picture with my mom that I took also in March of 2020. My last teaching gig that I did before everything shut down was at Duke University. I teach for their Fuqua School of Business, and I flew down from New York to Durham to teach my program. And when the plane landed, I checked my messages, and there was a notice that the school had shut down. But because I was doing an executive ed program and everybody had already flown in from around the world for the program, we decided to run it anyway. So the entire campus was shut, and we were the only people on campus for that week doing the course. But my mother, she was prescient. The CDC was saying, no, you don't need masks. But my mother taught herself how to sew masks by watching videos in Japanese and Chinese on YouTube. That was a pretty innovative move. She wasn't the only one who was innovating. I spent the summer of 2020 walking around the streets of New York City, trying to make sense of this, trying to figure out what was going on, and seeing how people were making do in these straitened circumstances. This was an Indian restaurant that I used to go to in the East Village of New York. It started out as a regular Indian restaurant. You could dine in, enjoy food. Of course, for a lot of 2020, it was prohibited to eat indoors in New York, like here in San Francisco. So of course they did, takeout and delivery like a lot of places, but they also did something pretty creative. They said, what resources do we have that are not being tapped? What else could we offer to our customers? And they realized, oh, well, we could cook the food, but we also have all this food. We have all these ingredients. And so they opened up a grocery store within the restaurant. You can see they've got flour, they've got ketchup, they've got all the ingredients. They decided to find a new way of looking at the problem. This is a place in the Washington Heights neighborhood of New York City. You may have seen on film the musical version of The Neighborhood last summer with the movie In the Heights that Lin-Manuel Miranda did. But in the actual Washington Heights, there's a little cafe, a little coffee shop called Tazo. And they have a pretty unusual assortment of services that they provide. You can see on their sign here, they are a pastry shop, they're a cafe, they're a wine bar. Oh, and they're an antique shop. They're an antique shop because when the restrictions were created that you could not dine indoors, they said, well, we have all this space. What can we do with this space? And they realized they needed a creative use for it. The owner happened to be an antique collector. He said, well, restaurants are closed, but antique shops are not. He moved his entire collection inside and started selling it to his customers. The pandemic forced us to adapt. Even the poor, unloved for so long QR code finally got its day in the sun. I feel happy for the QR code. But the truth of all of this is we saw over the past 2 years what short-term thinking can do. I'm not here to knock short-term thinking. In fact, it did all of us a lot of good. Because the truth is, in a crisis, in a moment when all your expectations go out the window, in a moment where it's uncertain, you don't know what's going to happen, things can change from day to day in dangerous ways. We need the ability to pivot, to adapt, to be agile. Short-term thinking is great. But here's something that I believe, and I think you do too. Short-term thinking has its place, and it can't be the only way that we operate. As humans, we tend to fall into ruts. We tend to keep doing what is working for us. And over the past 2 years, all of us have over-indexed on short-term thinking. We had to. There was not a choice. You could make 2-year plans, and then God would laugh. But now, finally, as we are, fingers crossed, entering a new moment when we're just a little bit farther along with COVID, with adapting to things, with being able to get the ground underneath our feet a little bit more stable. I know that's a bad metaphor in California, but you know what I mean. I think it's time for us to recalibrate. Short-term thinking is great as far as it goes, but we also know that it's important to start consciously retraining our sights. But it's not something that happens on its own. It's not something that happens naturally. We have to consciously make a change. We have to consciously make a shift in terms of how we are viewing the world and the steps that we're taking. And I know by dint of your being here, by dint of your being part of the Long Now Foundation, that this is something that you care about. So let's talk about what that actually might look like. I wrote a book that came out last fall called The Long Game: How to Be a Long-Term Thinker in a Short-Term World. And for me, one of the questions I really wanted to explore was how can we actually apply the principles of long-term thinking, the principles of strategic thinking to our own lives, to our own careers. Many of us do this for our businesses. For those of you who, are entrepreneurs or you work inside organizations, this is something that we consciously try to do. Where are we going in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years? We often fail, though, to really apply that same lens to our own lives. And again, I know because you support the Long Now Foundation, you are used to very long-term thinking. And that is incredibly important. But it's also important to think about how we can be living it out in our own lives. How can we manifest some of that thinking? And it's an interesting question because the truth is, right, there's pretty much no disagreement about this. Almost everybody thinks long-term thinking, strategic thinking is a good thing. I was asked to give a talk a couple years ago by the Peter Drucker Forum. It is an organization based out of Austria that celebrates the great management thinker Peter Drucker. And they asked me to give a talk about strategy. And I said, well, what facet? What do you want me to talk about? And they said, anything, something about strategy. I said, okay. So I started thinking, what is most interesting about strategy? What hasn't been talked about? What angle could I find? And what I realized after pondering it for a bit is that for me, the central question about strategy, about strategic thinking, long-term thinking, is if everyone seems to think it's a good idea, why aren't we doing more of it? There was a study that was done a few years ago by an organization called the Management Research Group. They surveyed 10,000 senior leaders, and of the 10,000, 97% said that the single most important thing they could do for the future of their organization, for their organization's success, was to be better long-term thinkers. 97%. Literally almost everyone thinks this is a good idea. And yet, a separate study that was done around the same time, 96% of the leaders surveyed said they didn't have time for strategic thinking. There is a huge disconnect going on in our own lives. Why is it that we are not doing what we say we believe in, that we say is so important? I mean, the truth is we know some of the reasons. We know the obvious reasons. We have too many meetings. We have too much email. That's all true. There's distractions. But what is often happening for us is that we are failing to make the conscious choice to redirect our energy. We're getting sucked into the minutiae, and it creates long-term consequences that can be incredibly deleterious. I mean, just as in a large-scale environmental sense, us going along and not really thinking about things like the climate can create massive consequences downstream. The same thing's true in our own lives. I have a friend who lives here in California. He's just nearby in Sausalito, named Jonathan Brill. And I talked to him for my book, The Long Game. And he said something that stayed with me. He said, the worst thing you can do is to get a highly competent group of people together, smart, talented, capable people, and tell them to win at the wrong thing. Because the problem is they will do it. Now, for all of us, we don't want to get to the end of the line and realize that we have been optimizing for the wrong thing. But if we keep getting sucked into the short term, if we let ourselves be sucked into the short term of heads down, do the thing, get to the next meeting, accomplish the next milestone, and we never actually lift our heads up long enough to ask whether we're doing the right things, whether the things we're doing should be done at all, whether our energies and our talents might be better spent in other ways. If we don't ask those questions, then we risk at the end of the line winning at the wrong things. I want to prevent that from happening for myself and for you, for all of us. So what does it look like? Well, I know one of the things that's most special about the Long Now Foundation is that this is a bulwark. This is an organization that has for so long put a stake in the ground and said, no, this matters. We have to zoom out. We have to look at a longer time frame than almost anybody is used to, a time frame that is far beyond our own lifetimes. in order to make smarter choices and better decisions. But I know also it can be challenging sometimes when we look at these timelines that are too big for the human mind to even really comprehend, to think about how it plays out in our day to day. How do we apply it? How do we live it? What does it look like? And what it reminded me of is a quote from Rabbi Tarfon. This is somebody who lived 2,000 years ago, just after the destruction of the Second Temple in 79 AD. And he said something that I think is relevant for all of us, which is you're not required to complete the work of perfecting the world, but neither are you permitted to desist from trying. We can't do it all. We have to recognize that. We have to make peace with it. We're not going to get it all done. But there are things that we can do. There are things, in fact, that we have to do, that we are called upon to do. I recently bought a place in Miami. And as you might imagine, it's become a popular destination for my friends. I've had a lot of house guests the past 3 to 4 months. And you can tell pretty fast who's a good house guest and who is not. We all need to be better house guests on earth. So how? How does it work? I've been thinking about this question a lot, and I imagine you have as well. And so I wanted to share with you 7 strategies that I hope might be helpful, that have informed my thinking and might be useful to you. So the first thing that I realized, going back to this question of if strategy is so great, why don't we do it? One of the things that I realized is that for so many of us, what is lacking, what is profoundly lacking in our lives is white space. In a very literal sense, for most of us, if you look at your calendar, you're probably going to see a sea of blue, literally white space. Time that is unspoken for is probably pretty scarce. And it's not the worst thing in the world, but it has its consequences. A few years ago, when I was writing a previous book of mine, I interviewed David Allen, who some of you may have heard of. He's a well-known productivity guru. He wrote the book Getting Things Done. And he told me something interesting. He said, it doesn't take a huge amount of time to have brilliant ideas, but what it takes is space. It's almost like a Zen koan if you roll it around in your head, but it's true. Right? I mean, we all know if you have to come up with some innovation, some new idea, it's not, oh, I need to set aside 40 hours and bang my head against the desk. That is not how the brilliant ideas come, right? It comes sometimes in a moment, in a flash. You're in the shower, you're walking, you're jogging, you're doing something. But what enables it to come is having the space to make the connections. We will never get that space if we are constantly pulled down by details, by worries, by ruminations, and by back-to-back meetings that are so intense we feel we can never catch up. We need white space if we are going to have the mental bandwidth to be able to even begin to engage in long-term thinking, to be able to step back enough from our present circumstances to entertain those questions. And so what I've realized in terms of how to get it, we have to be vigilant. We have to be really vigilant, because the truth is, unfortunately, It is literally in everyone else's best interest for you to be at their beck and call. It is way more convenient for other people for you to respond within 5 minutes to their emails. But it's not convenient for you or for your ability to do long-term thinking. We have to be guarding the perimeters. And so I've come up with 4 questions that I like to apply. Sometimes we need a checklist, frankly, whether you're an airline pilot, whether you're a surgeon, and also if you're a regular professional dealing with the onslaught of requests that come in modern life. The 4 questions that I like to ask when a request comes through. Number 1, what is the actual cost involved? Sometimes we delude ourselves sometimes. People say, oh, do you mind if I just pick your brain for a few minutes or whatever it is? And you realize, oh, all of a sudden the thing you say, well, it's just a few minutes. And suddenly the call becomes a coffee. Suddenly you're driving. Suddenly there's traffic. And 2 hours later, time has slipped away on something you didn't quite want to do. What is the total cost involved? Number 2, what's the physical and emotional cost of the request? I think COVID has probably put this into sharper relief for most of us. There are times, frankly, when we are run down, times when we're burned out, times that are busy periods. And frankly, things need to clear a higher bar in order to be worthwhile to say yes. We have to think about those things. What put this into relief for me, this is pre-COVID, I had a friend that invited me to speak at a conference in the Caribbean. Sounded so cool. I get a free trip to the Caribbean. My friend's going to be there. It sounded good. I wanted to say yes. But there was a small voice inside me that said, wait, don't say yes yet. And I looked at my calendar and I realized I was traveling all the week before. I was traveling all the week after. And I thought, would I actually enjoy this if I had 3 consecutive weeks of travel? Could I actually even have fun in the Caribbean? Or would I be so exhausted from that it wouldn't be worth it? And I took the step back and I made the quite hard decision to say no. And I turned it down. Number 3, a question that I like to ask is, what's the opportunity cost? We so often, when we are considering a request, say, well, should I do this or should I not do this? That is actually the wrong question. The right question is, should I do this or should I do literally anything else in the universe that takes that amount of time? Our lives are one unit. We have to start thinking of them that way. And 4th and finally, time is always helpful here. As Long Now fans know, how will you feel about this a year from now? Will you feel bad that you said no? Will you feel bad you didn't go do it? Or will it be forgotten? Distance can be helpful, but we have to fight for that white space as a prerequisite for the work that we want to do to clear the decks. Number 2, one of the principles, it's actually my favorite in writing the long game that I came across, was something that I first learned about nearly a decade ago. I became familiar with the work of Frances Frye, who's a Harvard Business School professor, and her partner and co-author, Anne Morris. They wrote a book back in 2012 called Uncommon Service. It was a book about the service industry. Service industry businesses, everything from banks to airlines to restaurants. And they were trying to look into the question, which probably most of us as consumers have asked ourselves, which is, why is it that so many businesses are just average? Why are so many businesses just meh? If you think about like, oh, what's a great business? Most of us actually have trouble coming up with it. And yet, of course, nobody's setting out to be average. They all want to be great. They just aren't. Why? And what they discovered was this. The businesses that were just meh, they were all perfectly happy to try to say, oh, we want to be great at this. We want to be great at that. They were all keen to do that. Everybody loves to think about what they want to be great at. But they refused to do something that hindered them. And what they refused to do is they refused to choose what to be bad at. What Francis Fry and Ann Morris discovered is that there's a lot of wishful thinking in our lives. And this is true if you run a business. Frankly, it's true for ourselves as well. We like to dream that we can be excellent at something and then just fine, totally cool at everything else. That's not how it works. I'll give you an example. There was a bank that they profiled that was actually a very successful bank. And this bank, they did something interesting. Unlike almost every other bank, these guys stayed open really late. They were open till 8 o'clock weeknights. They were open on weekends. Fantastic. Their customers loved it, obviously. But why doesn't every bank do it? You probably know the answer, which is that it's expensive. But what this bank did, they found a way to pay for it. The way they paid for it is they took the savings rate, the rate on savings deposits. They shrunk it down and made it almost non-existent. It was kind of terrible. But to their customers, it didn't really matter. It was a lot more important. It was a lot more salient to be able to go to the bank at 7:30 at night. But most companies are not willing to make those hard choices, and most people are not either. If we are ever to truly excel at something, if we're willing to take what's necessary to be great, we have to be willing to choose what to be bad at. What are we willing to give up to get there? Most of us refuse to choose, and by not choosing, we stay average. That's when I learned that long-term thinking is in a lot of ways a test of character. It's a test of the courage to make choices. Number 3, we also have to balance our portfolio. One of the things that I learned that was a little uncanny to me, but of course, if you think about it long enough, it makes sense. As I was writing The Long Game, which is a book about strategic thinking, long-term thinking, as I was writing it, I began to realize in so many ways, it felt like an investment book. I felt like I was writing a personal finance book. Of course, it's not about money or personal finance at all, but the principles about the compound value of one's time, one's energy, one's efforts are actually remarkably similar. And it's also true that we need to think about balancing our portfolios. For most of us, if you literally know one thing about personal finance, what you probably know is that it is a bad idea to put all your eggs in one basket, right? You don't want to own one stock. Most people think that's a pretty bad idea. You want to balance your portfolio. You want to have some of your money in cash and some of your money in moonshots, right? And it's true in investing. It's also true in our lives. So this is San Francisco, Silicon Valley. You guys, I'm sure, are familiar with Google, now Alphabet's, famous 20% time. Now, the premise behind this is that Google, I'll call them that for the sake of argument, has historically encouraged its employees to spend up to 20% of their time on more speculative activities. Now, let's put the asterisk in. I know many Googlers, they say, that's not really a thing anymore. But it should be. And it actually is uncommon, but it's not obsolete. studies estimate that about 10% of Googlers still take advantage of 20% time. This is how Google News was invented. This is how Gmail was invented. It is the opportunity to explore without the immediate need for a payoff. It is the opportunity to explore in ways that you suspect but are not certain may pay off in a big way in the future. This is something that is incredibly valuable, certainly for Google, if you're creating the next Gmail. But I want to argue it's incredibly valuable for us as well. We should be creating 20% time in our own lives. So often, we tend to just focus in. We have our day job. Okay, we're doing our day job. The rest of our time might be taken up with family or other responsibilities. I want to urge you to think about carving out time. Maybe 20% is too much, fine. You can find 5%. But to think about what your speculative long-term activity is. What is your learning edge? Where are you growing? I'll give you an example of a fairly random thing that I have been doing for the past 6 years, which this is me, as you can probably see. I decided in 2016 that I wanted to learn how to write musical theater. And I had never done it before. I had no background. I had really no idea. But I set myself to it. And in the past 6 years, I have been accepted to and have completed one of the nation's top musical theater training programs. I've written a complete musical. I've done multiple musical theater fellowships. You've probably heard the saying, and I think you've probably experienced it in your own life. I know I have, that we tend to overestimate what we can accomplish in a day, and we tend to underestimate what we can accomplish in a year. I want to suggest that is even more true when we get to 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. You can go from a zero start to actually becoming quite accomplished at something if you give yourself enough time. We fail to recognize, just as we sometimes miss the value of investing $10 a month in your 20s, we tend to miss exactly how much we can learn and how much we can grow and how skilled we can become if we invest time starting now over a period of years. So maybe ask yourself, what is your 20% time? What could that be? Now, something that comes up a lot when it comes to long-term thinking and pursuing long-term projects is this question of when and whether to quit. Because the thing about a long-term project is that oftentimes it takes a long time. And it can almost feel like you're going into a dark tunnel, right? Because you don't really know what's going on. You don't really know for sure if it's working. There's an economist at the University of Chicago named David Galenson, and he's done a lot of study around the art world. And there are some people, like Picasso, that from the time he was young, he was in his early 20s, everybody said he was a genius. His whole life, everybody thought he was a genius. That is very handy if people say that about you. But the truth is, for most of us, we are not anointed in our 20s and celebrated for the duration of our entire lives. It doesn't really work that way. For a lot of us, our lives are a lot more like Cézanne. Cézanne was not recognized at all until he was in his mid to late 40s. Up until that point, nobody thought he was any good. And the hard part is he wondered if he was any good. You keep going because you think maybe, you think you've got something, but maybe they're right and you're not. It can be hard to tell in the moment if something is not working or if something is not working yet. That's the question, right? So Some of you, by dint of being here in the world of technology, you may have read or may be familiar with the collaborations that Stephen Kotler and Peter Diamandis have done. They've written some great books, Bold, Abundance. They have explored the world of so-called exponential technology, the kind of technology that grows at an exponential pace, whether that's artificial intelligence or self-driving cars or 3D printing. If we want to go back to something that we now think of as normal, a good example is digital photography. That's also an exponential technology. They created a map, a kind of framework about the progression of exponential technology. And what they discovered, they came up with a name that I thought was so captivating. It was a concept that I thought had a lot of relevance and a lot of salience for our own lives. They said that in the midst of developing an exponential technology, there is something that they dubbed the deception phase. Now, what is that? Well, it turns out that in the early days of a technology, and you've probably seen this, in the early days of a technology, everybody thinks it's so cool. Oh, there's so much buzz, there's so much buzz. But you look at it, and after a while, it just seems like, well, nothing's really happening. It's not really going anywhere. I've been hearing about this for 20 years. When's this actually going to pan out? So overblown. You hear that a lot. The truth is, if you're somebody who's close to the process, you know it. If you're moving forward with digital photography and you're able to get it from 0.01 pixels to 0.02 pixels to 0.04 pixels, that's actually kind of amazing, right? 0.08. Moving on and on. It's actually kind of amazing progression. It's doubling, it's doubling, it's doubling. But the problem is that it's still invisible to the naked eye. The world around you, unless they are looking very closely, they can't tell the difference. It still looks like a big fat zero. And so they dismiss it. They say, well, that's dumb. And you know, or you hope, you think you know that you're making progress, but it's often very, very hard to drown out the voices of all the people around you saying, it's so overblown. That's the deception phase. Because once we cross, as they say, the whole number barrier, once we make enough progress to get from 1 to 2 to 4 to 16, all of a sudden people start to say, whoa, where did that come from? It's been doubling all along. They just couldn't see it. But for so many of us, if we're working on a project that's important to us, if we are building a career, things take time. It can be very hard to keep going, but we have to keep going. If we see that progress, we have to keep moving forward because that is the only way to get to the other side, is to get through that deception phase. I promised you 7. Let's go. Number 5, strategic patience. I personally have never been a fan of patience. Certainly not regular patience. When I was a little kid, my mom used to say I was so impatient because frankly, I kind of hated being a little kid. I was so offended I couldn't drive. I was so offended I couldn't vote. I was offended I couldn't start a business. There was so much I wanted to do and I couldn't. And she'd say, well, just be patient. And the way I heard that, I think frankly, the way she meant it was kind of just shut up for a little while. Just stop. That's not the kind of patience that I like. I don't think I'm ever going to make peace with that. But I created a new term, and it's one that I like better, which is strategic patience. Because for me, what we have to do is simultaneously recognize 2 things. Number 1, sometimes things do take a while, and that can be exceptionally annoying. I don't like it that they take a while sometimes. But you know what? Being mad at the seed does not make the seed grow faster. It takes however long it takes. We recognize that. But it's also true that we don't have to be passive in the face of it. We don't have to just sit back and wait and hope. We can come up with hypotheses. We can be doing things. We can be testing things. We can be trying things that will help, that will hasten what we're doing. We have to be thoughtful about recognizing what it takes to get there, that it may take longer than we want, but that we're willing to make that bet. We're willing to make that investment. There was an interview a decade ago in Wired magazine. Jeff Bezos was interviewed, and they asked him, what is it that is Amazon's competitive advantage? Why is Amazon so successful? And what he said, I think, is quite powerful. He said, Amazon is willing to invest on a 7-year time frame. If it takes 7 years for something to show a profit, it's okay. He said, our competitors are only willing to invest on a 3-year time frame. They have to turn a profit within that time frame. If they don't, they're going to scrap it. They're not even going to try it. That is the competitive advantage. And I think there's something powerful in that. I mean, you can imagine this is true, right? In most corporations, whatever executive is spearheading the initiative, he or she might be gone in 3 years. Why would they bother? Why would they bother to invest in an initiative that someone else is going to get the glory for? The incentives are not lined up right. But if we, like Amazon, are willing to make choices to defer the gratification, because the good news, we're still going to be us in 7 years. The benefits will accrue to us in our lives, in our careers, in the impact that we want to make. If we can be willing to outwait and outlast the people around us, if we can be willing to endure the deception phase for longer, it enables us to tackle bigger, harder, more meaningful, more strategic problems. It's how Amazon was able to build a competitive moat with things like Amazon Web Services or Amazon Prime. And frankly, it's how we can build a competitive moat in our own lives by doing work that is more meaningful and more powerful than other people are willing to attempt, who are seeking a quick payoff for it. Number 6. So Silicon Valley is actually pretty good about this. Fail fast. We know that failure in many places around the world is stigmatized pretty heavily. You get one chance, you blow it. All right, sorry, no more chances. Here, you get other chances, which I think is quite powerful. It's also important to recognize that something is not a failure until you call it. It's not a failure until you stop trying. And I'll give you one example from my own career, since we're talking about how this applies at work. I wanted to be in academia. I was one of the, kind of geeky people that loved school. I loved my professors. I admired them so much. And so after I finished college, I got a master's degree. After I finished my master's degree, I said, well, I want to do this. I want to be a professor. And so I applied to 3 different doctoral programs, and I got turned down by all of them. I didn't even have a plan B. I assumed I would get into one. I had good grades. It was shocking to me that I did not get into any of them. I didn't know what to do. And I came up with a plan B pretty fast. I got a job as a journalist, and I thought, okay, well, there's writing, there's asking questions and being intellectually curious, so I moved the ball forward. But of course, a year later, I got laid off from my job as a journalist and sort of had to keep going and keep reinventing myself. But today, I actually have managed to find a way in the side door. I teach for 2 different top 10 business schools, for Duke and Columbia. I don't have a PhD. I don't have an MBA. I went to liberal arts schools. I didn't even take any college business classes. I was able to climb in the side window of academia by networking and connecting and getting experience and not giving up on my vision of being able to be part of the academy and teaching and learning and things that were important. It felt at the time when I was 22 like the door was being shut forever, but it's actually pretty rare that the door is shut forever. And if we keep looking for the windows that are open, we can often find it. I promised you 7. The last point that I wanted to make, and soon we're going to be having a conversation. Xander is going to be leading a chat, and I know many of you have been submitting questions, and I'm excited to tackle them. The last point that I wanted to make is that as we think about our own long-term future, our own long-term vision, in a lot of ways, the North Star that we can look to is a really simple question. What kind of person do you want to be? This is a friend of mine. Her name is Alyssa Cohn. I write about her in The Long Game. And the reason I like her story, Alyssa, maybe like some of you guys, was a huge Hamilton fan. She was really into it. And when she learned that Lin-Manuel Miranda had a new side project, she was all in on it. She learned about Freestyle Love Supreme. It was a show on Broadway. It's a freestyle hip-hop improv rap show. And even better, they created an academy. It was a training program to teach regular people how to do freestyle hip-hop rap, just like the performers. She immediately said, I'm in. That sounds great. And she envisioned a cool, fun class where lots of other Hamilton fans like her were learning to rap. She shows up for class. And when she shows up, she realizes it's Alyssa and about 20 guys who are all wearing hoodies, who are all about 2 decades younger than her, and who are all extremely good rappers. This was not very comfortable. After the first class, completely chastened, completely mortified by her inability to immediately break out into rap, she emailed the instructor and she said, I'm really sorry to do this. I feel like I should withdraw. It's just, I don't fit in. I don't think I can do this. And he wrote back to her with some incredibly wise words. He said, Alyssa, the goal is not to turn you into a professional rapper. The goal is to help you become a more creative and uninhibited person. And she thought about it and she realized, oh, right, that is my goal. She kept taking the classes. She spent 2 months every Monday night taking the hip-hop, improv, beatbox, rap classes. And just before the world shut down in 2020, she gave a concert performance with her class, and she had friends from all over see her perform improv rap. She got so into it, she even made a YouTube rap video, which this screenshot is taken from. But ultimately, the question that I think all of us can ask ourselves as we think long term, as we think about our vision for our own lives and how we want to lead them, is what kind of person do you want to be? What are you optimizing for? With that, I'm going to open it up for the conversation with Xander, and I'm so glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. I see. Well, that was great. All right. I guess I'd love to start a little bit with your first couple books were more specific kind of business books, and this is obviously a much larger picture thing. How did you decide to do this? I think you decided to do this before the pandemic, right? And then the pandemic happened.
I did. My first few business books were more tactical in some ways. My first book was about professional reinvention. I've written about how to become a recognized expert in your field, and a book about entrepreneurship and creating multiple revenue streams in your business. But as I was thinking about the long game, I actually, in many ways, hearkened back to some of some of my early interests and my early training. I was a philosophy major as an undergraduate. I have my master's degree is in theology, and it took me a long time to actually piece together and to make this connection. Sometimes people, they like to ask these sort of super insulting questions like, "You studied philosophy. Do you ever use that?" And I didn't have a good answer. But what I came to realize was, in a lot of ways, our in our contemporary American society, so much of our sense of personal meaning derives from work, from the work that we do or who we are in the professional world. I realized that philosophy and theology actually aren't that far off from it. That if we really want to meet people where they're at and address their sense of who they are in the world and what is the impact they can make in the world, that bringing some of these philosophical considerations to bear is important. And so I started looking into that and diving into that.
Cool. And I think one of the things that you brought up in the book that that I appreciated is this idea that we kind of obsess on being busy, and you ask somebody how they're doing, and often the answer is "I'm so busy," but also that is a reflection on making us feel important, and how that one of the things you kind of have to get over this.
Yeah, it's really true. There's been some fascinating research, notably by Sylvia Bellezza at Columbia University, that's talked about exactly this point, that in many cultures, most notably American culture, busyness really is a form of status signaling, that we are essentially finding a kind of politically correct way of saying, "Oh, I'm so popular. I'm so in demand. I'm awesome." And it's we don't necessarily think of ourselves as doing it, but it's actually a little bit obnoxious, and we need to stop.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think the true power is being able to schedule the downtime, which I think you talked about. And one of my favorite things is when I'm going to do a trip or something, and then all of a sudden it gets canceled, and then I realize I have this openness in my calendar. But I think it's an interesting idea of how to. I mean, have you thought about some of the techniques for how to do this in your life?
Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to actually, sort of managing calendars and carving things out, one of the principles that has been most helpful to me, again, to give a little Silicon Valley shout out, is a concept that Paul Graham, the founder of Y Combinator, has talked about. He's written about manager schedule and maker schedule, and the way that it's sort of played out in his essay was, you think about a manager at a tech company, and they're having meetings, they're supervising things, they're keeping the projects going. Makers in his world, probably coders, are people who need large blocks of unstructured time so they can dive in and immerse themselves in projects. What I've actually found is that for most professionals, certainly this is true for me, we actually kind of have to do both, right? It can't be one or the other. And so I've modified this. And in terms of my own scheduling, I have, for the past few years, followed a principle where I have what I call maker days and manager days. And so I deliberately try to pack all my meetings into 1 or 2 days so that I'm just kind of going, I'm knocking them out. And then frankly, those are tiring days. But what it enables, what it allows, is for me to have the completely unstructured maker days. And I use that for writing or for, so-called deep work, which is actually quite effective to be able to do it. It's really hard to get into high quality work when you only have a half an hour in between meetings.
Yeah, so I mean, we're now stuck in an attention economy. In fact, an economy that sole goal is to distract us. And pretty much every piece of code being written is how to get you to be distracted. And I think it's an interesting question of how but nobody wants to be in that. So it's how are you thinking about how you get out of the attention economy in that space?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, we're constantly being lured. I think that there are individual questions about, what's the best thing for us. I mean, I feel like I have friends who have decided to get off social media entirely, and I respect that. That's great. I mean, I have one good friend who says, I have just found that I feel happier not doing it. That she sort of monitored herself, and she realized she would get competitive or she'd get depressed or whatever when she'd see what other people were doing, and so she eliminated it entirely. I don't feel like that's necessary for me, but we have to recognize the parameters that we're setting around these things and how we're using them. And I think it's also useful to understand what our goals are in things. I actually, there's so much backlash now. I mean, for years the tech world was valorized, probably to an excessive extent. We're in a period now where the tech world is being demonized, I think, to an excessive extent. But there was this wonderful woman who helped raise me. She was our family housekeeper, Anne, and she died last year. But up until the end of her life, I was in good touch with Anne, and called her regularly and things like that. And Anne died at 94, and every time I talked to her, she would tell me how much she loved Facebook because it was the only way that she was able to keep this ambient awareness of everyone in her life. All her kids, all her grandkids, all her great grandkids, all the people around her, they often didn't remember to call. They didn't visit, but she knew exactly what was going on. And it was incredibly meaningful to her. And so I'm never gonna condemn them universally. They helped Anne and they help a lot of people. So I think we have to recognize what is it good for and how does it work in our lives.
Right. And it's possibly why the next generation doesn't seem to be getting on Facebook because their parents are on it. But yeah, you're mentioning of like how to determine how to say no to things. I think is one of the most important skills that I'm certainly trying to learn. And that Brian Eno told me once. He said, anytime somebody asks me to do something, I imagine that I have to do it tomorrow. And if I had to do it tomorrow, would I say yes? And we have this thing where we discount the future. If it's 6 months, you're like, oh, fine, I'll do it then. But with this principle of if I had to do it tomorrow, it like makes it very, very clear if you truly actually want to do the thing. But I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the principles on how to figure out how to say no. You mentioned a few of them, but if you could expand on that.
Yeah, it is such an important question. One framework that I think is useful as well. This is like a low-hanging fruit tip that I like to share. Something that I had to learn the hard way in my own experience is that I often assumed, extremely erroneously, that other people had the same sort of framework or the same view about what was urgent, what was worth somebody's time, what was worth a particular form of communication. What I've come to realize is, frankly, there are some people out there that just are exceedingly not busy. They have a lot of time on their hands and they view things incredibly differently. And so I would get requests sometimes, and people would say things like, "Oh, hey, Dorie, are you free? Can you hop on a call?" And I would just assume like, "Oh, well, if somebody thinks that we need to hop on a call right away, it's got to be a big thing." And I came to realize like, "Oh, wait, maybe not." Maybe not. So what I started doing is actually just having an automatic request whenever somebody is ambiguous, because sometimes they're ambiguous because they're busy. I get it. Sometimes they're ambiguous because they forget. Sometimes they're ambiguous because they actually want to obfuscate their reasons. And so it's actually not uncommon. Oh, can we hop on a call because I want to tell you about the new investment that I want to pitch you? Can we hop on a call because I need your help with this thing that I don't really want to disclose up front. And so even just asking the question and getting clarity, okay, I'd like to help you. What would you like to talk about? It's not being aggressive. It's not, sort of threatening something, but it is really helpful in enabling you to understand what you're in for, what you're being roped into, so that you actually can dive in and just cut it off and say, "Oh, thank you so much, Sander. I appreciate it, but I'm actually not investing in movies right now," or whatever it is. I'm actually curious.
Force some more work on their part.
Yes, yeah, offload the burden, exactly. I'm actually curious. I mean, it's a little bit of a heavy mantle to be running the Long Now Foundation and to, in some ways, be this like paragon of long-term thinking, and yet have to run an organization that has so many day-to-day responsibilities, like any organization. How do you thread that needle? How do you feel like you try to live out the principles in terms of how you conduct your work?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're trying to run a 10,000-year organization, you have to keep that perspective, but you also have to get some things done. And so that I think it's a balance. But I think what's nice about having that perspective is that and you had a slide up here, is that you don't have to finish the work. And so that I think to that point, to me, it's like, how do I start the work in a way that somebody else can finish it and that I can hand it off at some point? But it's actually very much on our mind right now, because we're just passing 25 years and we are going to have to do a generational shift. So one of the projects I've been working on is researching how everybody else has had long-term institutions. So it's very early in that research. So I don't have the answers yet, but I hope to get a lot of good stories from the longest lived organizations in the world and be able to come back and talk about them at some point. So yeah, it's very much on my mind, for sure. And I think you mentioned like how, when you have good ideas is not when you're overworked. And certainly the best ideas that I've ever had have come in the interstitial times. But you also have to load that with the brain, like with the parts of it that kind of inform you to it. And so that balance is something that I'm curious what you think about. Is how do you get enough kind of the information in, but then have the downtime to think about it?
Yeah, it is an interesting balance and an interesting challenge. I remember when I was in college and when I was in graduate school, I actually stopped reading for pleasure. I'm not sure if this was the case for other people as well, but I had always been, as a kid, a huge reader. I loved reading, and now, as an adult, I read all the time. But when I was in school and was essentially being forced to read hundreds of pages of pretty dense text every week, when it became my job, it was no longer fun to do it recreationally. And something that had been quite important to me kind of atrophied in that way. And I think that for me, one of the concepts that I was mentioning in the talk about white space, I think part of why that's so resonant is that what I've come to believe is that for a lot of us, for a lot of, white collar knowledge workers, the truth is most of our jobs are actually pretty cool. Most of it is actually pretty fun. Not all of it, of course. I mean, you can't, it would be impossible to dream up a job where literally you loved every single thing. But for many of us, we are in the extremely fortunate position where most of what we do is actually quite interesting and quite meaningful. But there's a big but. It's that we often are forced to do so much of it in such a compressed amount of time that we actually have a hard time enjoying any of it. Even if on its own it would be fun, it would be interesting, it would be good, it's really hard to enjoy something when you're in a speed round, or when one scoop of ice cream is great, eating 25 scoops of ice cream is going to make you throw up. And so I think the question is, how can we just buy ourselves a little bit more margin, because just even a little bit more space in our lives to be able to slow down, to appreciate things, to be in the moment is what is going to give us the ability to have that balance, to have the inputs, but be able to think about it and do something about it. There's a folk band that I really like called the Neilds, and they have a song lyric that I think applies in many ways to our present predicament. They say that the difference between neurosis and psychosis is only 2 hours of sleep. And I think with our jobs and with our professional lives, it's actually pretty similar. That, most of us have probably tried to optimize and life hack our way to a lot of things, right? I am making an educated guess here that most people in this auditorium are not actually the people who are spending 17 hours a week watching television, right? It's not like, oh, just watch less television, you can get it all done. Like, no, I get it. That's not what you're doing. You are actually legitimately incredibly busy. But the battle, in many ways, is won at the edges. This is about reclaiming even an hour, 2 hours if we can manage, but even an hour a week. If we can weed whack our way through it, if we can fend off excess commitments, and frankly, no one else is going to do it for you. You have to be the vigilant gatekeeper here. But if you can buy yourself back an hour a week, it gives you space to be able to enjoy things a little bit more and to just think a little bit more clearly, to begin to get that space that's necessary for long-term thinking.
Indeed. Took a couple questions from the audience here. Elizabeth is asking, what are you personally bad at? What have you decided to be bad at? And how has this worked in your strategy?
Oh, it's such a good question. So one thing that I am super deliberately bad at is I have never really learned to cook properly. And so I live part-time in New York. And I buy all my food. I just buy it out. And in Miami, I pay someone to make meals for me. I have just realized it's not worth the time and the learning. Some people actually really relax in the kitchen. I find it incredibly stressful. So I've given up on that. Also, I feel legitimately bad about this. I'm trying to give myself more grace, but I am sometimes bad at responding to emails. And so I have, messages that I have not responded to that sort of haunt me, but I try to just realize, okay, they understand, it's okay, you'll get to it. And then, I think bad at might be the slight wrong frame. So I'll put it in air quotes, but I mean, the other honest truth is that part of the way that I've been able to spend a lot of time on my career is I'm not married. I don't have kids. These are trade-offs, right? And I have executive coaching clients and things like that. And they, people beat themselves up about all kinds of things, but I have people who, they wish they could go to this conference, but it's the same weekend as their daughter's lacrosse meet. And, but they might be all the people that they could meet at the conference and blah, 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 blah. And that's all true. That's all true. It's a choice. And I think that this is one of the most powerful things. Francis Fry and Ann Morris say we have to choose what to be bad at. It's not necessarily about being bad, but it means that we have to be willing to make the choice and to understand, all right, I may not be able to prioritize this or to go all in on this at this time, because actually going to the lacrosse meet is more important to me. And that is a very legitimate choice to make, but we need to be conscious about the choices we are making.
Nice. Yeah, I chose to never match my socks again. I got all black socks. I don't know how much time that saves me. Less cognitive load on my socks anyway. And Mariana Senko is asking, I think, maybe how to expand this thinking more institutionally, given that the majority of our institutions and companies exist on the short timelines, decades at best. How could we incentivize them in a more institutional environment? And even to that point, one of the things I've learned in my research about long-lived companies is that the Fortune 500 companies have, in the 1950, were lasting 61 years, and now they're less than 18 years old before. So we're losing almost 1 year per year of corporate longevity in and of itself. So it's an interesting statistic for how that's working.
Yes. Well, I am super eager for your research, Sandra, because I feel like you are going to answer this question in a very definitive way.
Thank you.
But I also I think it's hard, honestly. I mean, a big part of the reason, going back to one of the points in the talk, a huge reason that Amazon is able and willing to make long-term choices is, well, the guy who started it was running it. And he was very comfortable with that from the beginning. I mean, props where it's due. Jeff Bezos was willing to beat the drum from the minute Amazon went public. Don't expect profits. Don't expect profits. We are reinvesting, and that was the terms. They were very deliberate about reattaching that letter, that original shareholder letter, to every subsequent shareholder letter as a reminder for anyone who might erroneously think that profits would be coming. I mean, now, of course, profits are rolling in, but it took a really long time because they were willing to defer, and invest. And I actually think that structurally it is extremely hard, because if you do not have the owner who is running it, you have a lot of people who, in our current climate, I mean, I know people at the Long Now Foundation are in it for the long term. You have been here from the beginning. I know Danielle has been here for 16 years. I mean, the longevity is amazing because of the commitment to the vision and that sort of shared understanding. But in most corporate jobs, I mean, we know this. If somebody stays, 25 years, 16 years at a corporate job, we're like, what? It's like, oh my God, they're from the 50s. It's incredibly rare. And as a result of that, people are making choices that are optimized for themselves rather than for the entity. And so if you have a super mission-driven organization where everyone is bought into that shared vision, which that's a powerful thing for a company to create, then we might be able to overcome the natural bias of self-interest. But without that, it's really hard to do.
Indeed. Yeah. One of the other things I remember Jeff telling me is that when the stock prices were doubling, he made sure to tell all the employees that you are not twice as smart as you were last quarter. And when it goes down by half, you're not going to be twice as dumb. So just like, don't pay attention to that. And I think that was probably because a lot of those companies, when the stock prices went down, all the employees just left because they felt they were failing. So that's an interesting one. Back to your failure points. Adam is asking, what is some long-term thinking or strategic advice that you think is dangerous or disagree with?
That's great. Dangerous long-term thinking. Well, I think that an example of dangerous long-term thinking would be this. In general, we know human nature is optimized for the short term, right? I mean, for any of us, just rationally, if you can have a good thing now, or if you can have a good thing in 20 years, well, sure, let's take the good thing now. That's sort of how we are. We have to consciously override it to become sufficient long-term thinkers. And for some things you need to, because for certain meaningful, hard, worthy goals, you're only going to get there. The only path to it is long-term thinking. In general, that is a good thing. It is worth aspiring to. Where it becomes dangerous is the following. And my friend Marshall Goldsmith, the well-known executive coach, she has a book coming out about this actually in a month or two called The Earned Life. And I think it's a really important point. He says that something that we often fail to do, we get so good at saving for the rainy day. We get so good at deferring gratification. Some of us actually err on the side of never properly celebrating our accomplishments. We err on the side of saving all the money, never spending it, never enjoying it, never taking advantage of the things that we've earned. And I think this is a situation where we need to have moderation in all things. It's not really much fun for anyone. I don't think it you could call it a real success for somebody to die at the end of their lives, just having kept their head down and had this onerous, grueling existence because they keep putting it off for another day, another day, another day, and they never actually get to enjoy the fruits of what they've done. That doesn't mean you blow it. It doesn't mean that you are celebrating excessively or you're not putting aside money for charity or for relatives or things like that. But I think it's this kind of abstemiousness can become a self-perpetuating cycle. And it's important to celebrate the victories, and it's important to enjoy our lives along the way.
Yeah. No, if you've ever sat with somebody who's passing away, they never sit there and say, I wish I worked harder. They usually say, I wish I took that vacation. So yeah. So we're gonna wrap this up, but Kevin Kelly is gonna get the last question. What is your 10-year project that you are working on?
So my 10-year project, I alluded to this a little bit during the talk, but in 2016, I decided that I was going to learn to write musical theater. And it actually came out of a very specific circumstance. In 2015, the year before, I went a little crazy with work, I guess you could say. I was launching a book, and the honest truth was I was feeling a little depressed. And so as a way of burying that, I went on the road. And so I gave 74 talks that year, which was a lot. It came out to about 1.5 talks every week. And so that meant I was pretty much on a plane once or twice every week. And I was so incredibly exhausted at the end of the year. I was sick. I was just run down. And I thought, why am I doing this? Why did I decide it was a good idea to run myself to the point of exhaustion? And I was living in New York at the time, and I realized, why am I paying so much money to live in New York when I'm not actually in New York? I'm just on planes. It seemed really ridiculous. And so I came up with a New Year's resolution for myself. And my New Year's resolution was that as a way of leaning into the city, as a way of kind of reconnecting and appreciating where I was going to do one uniquely New York activity per week, something that you could only do in New York. So, maybe it's see a Broadway show or go to a museum or, take a, dumpling tour of Chinatown or, whatever it is. So one of the first things that I did was a guy that I knew invited me to a Broadway show. And so I said, yes, I will go to that show with you. It was like my first week's activity. And I went to this show. I went to see Fun Home, which won the 2016 Tony Award, a really amazing show. And the truth was, I had lived in New York about 1.5 years by that point. I had only been to one Broadway show. I really hadn't taken advantage of that. But I saw this show and it just hit me. And I went home and I woke up the next morning and I was seized with this feeling, with this sense that I needed to learn to write musical theater. And I decided to pursue that. And I have done so since then. And so I've taken, trainings and fellowships and moved it forward. But what I've come to learn is that the average show, it's a long process. It takes about 7 years on average, 7 or 8 years for a show to go from inception to actually making it to Broadway. There's a lot of steps along the way. So in 2016, I decided that I would create a 10-year goal for myself to have a show on Broadway for the 2026 season. So we're in 2022, so I'm working on it.
Thank you so much. Really good. Thank you all.